It is Christmas Eve, 1945. It is Christmas Eve, 1945. The war is over. American soldiers are coming home. The whole country is exhaling for the first time in years. Relieved, hopeful, ready to put the darkness behind them and just be home for the holidays. In Fayetteville, West Virginia, the Sodder family is celebrating. George and Jennie Sodder have 10 children, a comfortable house, a successful trucking business. The Christmas tree is lit. The younger children are too excited to sleep. George tells them to go to bed. They don't listen. They stay up playing. George gives up and goes to bed himself, leaving a few of the kids awake downstairs. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Jennie Sodder wakes up. The house is on fire. She screams for her children. George runs. They manage to get 5 of their 10 children out of the burning house. But 5 more are still inside. 5 children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty Sodder, ages 5 through 14, are trapped somewhere in the inferno. The fire burns so fast, so hot, that the house is gone in 45 minutes, and when the fire goes out and investigators sift through the ashes, they find nothing. No bones, no teeth, no remains of any kind, no evidence whatsoever that 5 children died in that fire. They were just gone, and for the next 22 years, their father George Sodder drove past a highway billboard every single day. A billboard he paid for himself, with photographs of his 5 missing children and the words, "Do you know them?" He died in 1968, still not knowing what happened to his children. This is not a legend. This is a documented, verified, deeply disturbing piece of American history that has never been explained, and the deeper you go into it, the more questions pile up, until you start to wonder whether those children died in a fire at all. Welcome to the Mystery Archive. Today we are talking about the Sodder children, one of the most heartbreaking and genuinely baffling cold cases in American history. Stay with me, because this story goes places you will not expect. To understand what happened on Christmas Eve 1945, you first need to understand who the Sodder family was, because their identity turns out to be directly relevant to the mystery. George Sodder was born Giorgio Sodu in Sardinia, Italy, in 1895. He immigrated to the United States as a young man, settled in West Virginia, changed his name to George Sodder, married a woman named Jennie, and built a life from scratch. He worked hard, built a successful coal transport trucking business, and raised 10 children in a large, comfortable house on a rural property outside Fayetteville. George was loud, passionate, opinionated, and deeply patriotic toward his adopted country. He had one political obsession that would turn out to be fatally relevant. He hated Mussolini. He had left Italy precisely to escape the kind of fascist authoritarianism that Mussolini represented, and he was vocal about it. He argued about it at his business. He argued about it with customers. He told anyone who would listen that Mussolini was a criminal and a thug, and that Italy's alliance with Hitler was a national disgrace. In the months before Christmas 1945, George had a series of encounters that, in retrospect, read like warnings. A stranger came to the Sodder property asking about George's truck fleet. He wanted to know how many trucks George had, what condition they were in, what routes they ran. George found the questions odd and turned him away. The man left, but not before making a comment that George found unsettling. Something about the Sodder property that implied knowledge of the layout of the house. Around the same time, a life insurance agent visited the Sodder home. George declined to buy insurance. The agent, before leaving, allegedly said something that George would remember for the rest of his life. That the Sodder house was going to burn down, and that George's children were going to be destroyed. George dismissed it at the time. People say strange things. He had no reason to believe a random insurance salesman was making a genuine threat. But he remembered it. He remembered it for the rest of his life. On December 24th, 1945, the Sodder family celebrated Christmas Eve together. George, Jennie, and all 10 children. The younger kids, including Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jennie Jr., 8, and Betty, 5, were too wound up with Christmas excitement to sleep. George and Jennie went to bed. The younger children stayed downstairs. At approximately 1 in the morning, Jennie Sodder woke up to the smell of smoke. She ran downstairs. The house was on fire. George woke.
They grabbed the children who were upstairs and nearest to them. 5 of the 10 Sodder children made it out of the house alive, but Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie Jr., and Betty were somewhere else in the house, and the fire was spreading with terrifying speed. George tried to go back in. The flames drove him back. He ran to his truck, intending to drive it around to the back of the house, climb onto the roof of the truck, and reach the upstairs windows where he thought some of the children might be. But the truck wouldn't start. He tried his second truck. It also wouldn't start. Both of his trucks he used professionally, trucks he maintained carefully, trucks that had been running perfectly that same day, refused to start in the one moment when he needed them to save his children's lives. A neighbor's phone call to the fire department went unanswered for hours. The fire station was only 2 miles away. The fire trucks didn't arrive until 8 in the morning, 7 hours after the fire started. By then, the house was ash. And when investigators sifted through those ashes, when they looked for the remains of 5 children, they found nothing. No bones, no teeth, no hair, no remains of any kind. 5 children. Nothing. The fire chief, a man named F.J. Morris, declared that the intensity of the fire had completely incinerated the bodies. He closed the case. The children were presumed dead. George and Jennie Sodder did not believe it for 1 second. Here is why George and Jennie refused to accept the official explanation, and why their refusal was not the irrational grief of traumatized parents, but was grounded in specific, documented, verifiable facts. Fact 1. Human bones do not fully incinerate in house fires. This is not a matter of opinion. It is established forensic science. The human skeleton is extraordinarily resistant to fire. Crematoriums that are specifically designed to incinerate human remains, operating at temperatures of up to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 to 3 hours, still leave bone fragments behind. House fires are intense, but they do not reach crematorium temperatures, and they do not burn for sustained periods. Forensic investigators routinely recover bone fragments, teeth, and other identifiable remains from even the most devastating house fires. The idea that 5 children, ranging in age from 5 to 14, with bones of varying sizes and densities, were completely and utterly incinerated without leaving a single fragment behind is, according to forensic experts, extraordinarily unlikely. Fact 2. The Sodder family kept a large steel safe in the house. After the fire, that safe was recovered. It was damaged and warped by the heat, but it was not melted. It was not destroyed. It was a steel safe, and the fire was not hot enough to fully destroy a steel safe. But the fire was supposedly hot enough to leave absolutely no trace of 5 children. Those two facts sit side by side, and they do not fit. Fact 3. Investigators also recovered the Sodder family's Christmas presents from the ashes. Personal belongings, household items. Not everything in that house was destroyed, but 5 children left no trace. Fact 4. In the days following the fire, several witnesses came forward with sightings that disturbed the family deeply. A woman named Mrs. Archibald Taylor claimed to have seen the Sodder children in a car on Christmas morning, being driven through town by strangers. She said the children looked frightened. The children in the car matched the descriptions of the missing Sodder kids. Another witness claimed to have seen a car driving away from the Sodder property in the middle of the night before the fire was even fully burning. And a local woman reported seeing a man throw something onto the Sodder roof shortly before the fire started. Something that flared and burned. Fact 5. The ladder. The Sodder house had an external ladder mounted on the side of the house, specifically for emergency escape. When George tried to use it to reach the upper windows during the fire, it was gone. It had been removed from its mounting. Someone had taken the ladder. Fact 6. Remember George's two trucks that wouldn't start? The morning after the fire, when investigators examined the trucks, they found that the ignition systems had been tampered with. The wiring had been cut or disconnected. Someone had deliberately disabled both trucks before the fire started. Fact 7. Investigators later found a telephone company employee who admitted that on the night of the fire, someone had cut the Sodder family's telephone line. Not at the pole, but low on the line, close to the house, in a way consistent with deliberate sabotage rather than fire damage. The fire started. The phones were cut. The trucks were disabled. The ladder was removed. The fire department took 7 hours to arrive. 5 children vanished without leaving a bone. This was not an accident. George and Jennie Sodder were absolutely certain of one thing. Their children had been taken. But by whom? And why? And if the children were taken, where did they go? George had a theory, and it pointed directly back to his vocal criticism of Mussolini. The Italian-American community in West Virginia in the 1940s was not monolithic. It contained people who had come to America, like George, specifically to escape fascism. And it also contained people who were loyal to the old country, who admired Mussolini, who were connected to Italian organized crime networks that had, during the war years, complex relationships with both Italian fascism and American power structures. George believed that his loud, public, repeated denunciations of Mussolini had made enemies. He believed that the stranger who came asking about his trucks was a scout. He believed the insurance agent's comment about his house burning down was a genuine threat. And he believed that on Christmas Eve 1945, someone had finally followed through. Not to kill his children, but to take them, to punish him, to make him suffer in a way that was slower and more agonizing than death. This theory sounds extreme, but it is not without historical grounding. Italian organized crime networks in mid-century America were real, powerful, and connected across state lines. The practice of targeting families to punish or coerce individuals was documented, and the specific technical elements of what happened that night, the cut phone line, the disabled trucks, the missing ladder, the speed of the fire, the lack of remains, all suggest coordinated, professional action rather than a random accident. George also pointed out that the fire started in a very specific location, near the fuse box, not in the kitchen, not near the fireplace, not where most accidental house fires begin, near the electrical panel. And here is something else George noted, something that sounds almost too strange to be true, but is documented in contemporary accounts. On the night of the fire, one of the surviving Sodder children, a teenage daughter named Sylvia, reported that before the fire started, she heard the telephone ring once and then go silent. She heard something hit the roof. She heard a car driving away. These were the sounds of the last few minutes before the Sodder family's world ended. And they do not sound like the sounds of an accidental fire. George Sodder spent the rest of his life investigating. He hired private detectives. He followed leads across multiple states. He spent significant amounts of his own money. And in 1952, 7 years after the fire, he did something that remains one of the most singular acts of parental desperation in American history. He built a billboard. On U.S. Route 16 outside Fayetteville, West Virginia, George Sodder erected a large roadside billboard with photographs of his 5 missing children. Photographs showing what they looked like in 1945, alongside artist renderings of what they might look like as they grew older. The billboard asked, "Do you know them?" It listed the details of the case. It offered a reward for information. George drove past that billboard every day. Every single day for years, he saw his children's faces staring down at him from that sign, and he kept going, and he kept looking. Leads came in. Most led nowhere, but some were genuinely strange. In 1967, 22 years after the fire, Jennie Sodder received a letter in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was a photograph of a young man, perhaps in his late 20s. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting Jennie did not recognize, were the words, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, lil boys, a 90132. Louis Sodder would have been in his early 30s in 1967. The photograph showed a young man with features that Jennie felt, with the certainty of a mother, were familiar. The strange message, "I love Brother Frankie, lil boys," appeared to be a coded message, as if the sender was trying to communicate something, but feared being too direct. Jennie hired a private investigator to trace the photograph and the postmark. The letter had been postmarked from somewhere in Central Florida. The investigator went to Florida and was never heard from again. He simply disappeared. No explanation, no contact, no report. The photograph remains unidentified. The letter's author was never found. The investigator was never located. George Sodder died in 1968, 1 year after the letter arrived. He died without answers. Jennie kept the billboard up for years after his death. She died in 1989, also without answers. The official position has never changed. The 5 Sodder children died in the fire of December 24, 1945. The state of West Virginia closed the case decades ago, but the people who have studied this case in-depth, investigators, true crime researchers, forensic experts, historians, almost universally agree that the official explanation is insufficient. The forensic reality of bone survival, the physical evidence of tampering, the eyewitness sightings, the mysterious letter, these are not the hallmarks of a tragic accident. These are the hallmarks of something much more deliberate and much more sinister. Several theories have been proposed over the years, and none of them have been definitively proven or disproven. The first theory, George's own theory, is that the children were kidnapped by organized crime connected to the Italian-American underworld as retaliation for George's anti-Mussolini activism. The war had just ended. Mussolini was dead. But his networks and the people who had profited from connections to fascist Italy were still operating. Taking George Sodder's children would have been a message. Your opinions have consequences. According to this theory, the children were smuggled out of the country, possibly to Italy, and raised under different names. The second theory is that the children were taken not by organized crime, but by a local individual or individuals with a personal grievance against George, the insurance salesman perhaps, or someone connected to him. George's trucking business was competitive. He had made enemies. Someone may have arranged the fire and the abduction without any connection to larger criminal networks. The third theory is the darkest, and it comes from a forensic angle. Some investigators have suggested that the children did not survive the initial fire, that they were killed before the house burned or died in the first moments of the fire, and that their remains were removed from the scene before investigators arrived. This would explain both the absence of remains and the eyewitness sightings of children in a car. Those sightings under this theory were either misidentifications or fabrications. But this theory runs into the same problem that all the theories run into. It requires a level of coordination, of planning, of professional execution that points away from a spontaneous crime and towards something organized and deliberate. Someone planned that night. Someone cut the phone lines. Someone disabled the trucks. Someone removed the ladder. Someone started that fire. Whether the children escaped it or died in it, someone made sure that George and Jennie Sodder would never know. There is one more detail that I want to leave you with, because I think it captures something essential about this story. In 2012, the Sodder children's surviving sister, Sylvia Sodder Paxton, who was 2 years old on the night of the fire and is the family member who has most actively continued to pursue the case, agreed to allow investigators to re-examine the original fire site. The property had been in the family all these years. They were digging, doing a careful archaeological survey of the area where the house had stood, and they found something. They found a vertebra, a human vertebra, buried about a foot beneath the surface of the former yard, not far from where the house had stood. The vertebra was sent for forensic analysis. The analysis determined that it was human. It was not charred. It had not been exposed to fire. It was buried deliberately. The DNA analysis was inconclusive. The bone was too degraded after nearly 70 years in the ground to extract a reliable genetic profile. But here is the question that keeps investigators awake at night. If the children died in the fire, if their bodies were fully incinerated, as the official conclusion states, then whose vertebra was buried in the yard? And why was it not charred? And why was it buried? If the children did not die in the fire, if they were taken, then what happened to them in the decades since? Are there people alive today in their 70s who know they are not who they were told they are, who have fragmented, dreamlike memories of a Christmas Eve in West Virginia, who have been carrying a secret their whole lives that they don't fully understand. The billboard came down eventually. George is gone. Jennie is gone. Most of the people who were there that night are gone, but Sylvia is still looking. And somewhere, in Italy or Florida or somewhere in America or nowhere at all, the answer to what happened to Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty Sodder on Christmas Eve 1945 is still waiting to be found. I find this case almost unbearable to think about for too long. Not because it is gory or violent, it isn't, not on the surface, but because of what it did to a family over decades. Because of George Sodder driving past that billboard every day for 16 years. Because of a mother receiving a photograph in the mail and spending the rest of her life wondering if that young man's face was really her son. Because of 5 children who were there one moment and gone the next, and who, if they survived, may have grown up not knowing that their parents never stopped looking for them. That is the cruelty at the heart of this story. Not just what happened, but the not knowing, the specific sustained torture of not knowing. George Sodder could have accepted the official conclusion. He could have buried 5 empty caskets, grieved, and moved on. A lot of people in his position would have done exactly that. Instead, he spent 22 years and his own money and his own health refusing to let the question die because he was a father, and he was not convinced his children were dead. I don't know if he was right. Nobody does. But I'll tell you this. The evidence that something deeply wrong happened on that Christmas Eve in 1945 is overwhelming. And the evidence that the official explanation is complete and adequate is almost non-existent. The Sodder children case is officially closed, but it has never been solved. And the next time you drive down a rural American highway and you see a billboard, I want you to think about a father who put his children's faces up on one of those signs and drove past it every day for 16 years, just in case somebody, somewhere, knew something. That's all it takes sometimes. Just one person who knows something. If you're watching this and you've never heard this story before, now you have. Share it, because that's what George Sodder would have wanted. More people knowing, more eyes looking, more chances that someone somewhere finally says, I know what happened. Thank you for watching the Mystery Archive. Every week we go looking for the stories that history almost forgot. And every week we find something that reminds us how strange and dark and human the past really is. Subscribe if you want to keep looking with us, hit the bell, and check the description. I've linked the best resources on the Sodder case, including Sylvia Paxton's ongoing efforts to reopen the investigation. I'll see you next time.